You've written extensively about the word sugar because unfortunately media outlets and people misuse the word, they draw erroneous conclusions, and then they develop eating habits that are not necessarily evidence-based. And it's all predicated on the fact that people sort of misunderstand what the word sugar actually means. So can you give us a little insight into where the confusion about sugar starts and how to make sure that people with diabetes fundamentally understand the difference between added sugar and naturally occurring sugar?
Right. And that's maybe an excellent place to begin a discussion of many different kinds of confusion. There may be, Cyrus, as many different kinds of confusion about sugar as there are kinds of sugar in the food supply. So the starting point would be added sugar. It comes in many varieties. So it may be sucrose, it may be from sugar cane, it may be from sugar beets. These days, more often than not, it's high fructose corn syrup, which is essentially produced in a series of enzymatic steps from corn. But it is a sweetener that is added to processed foods and drinks. And it's very important to distinguish that from pure fructose, which is fruit sugar found in whole fruits. And I think one of the major areas of confusion is, okay, if sugar is really bad for me, and by the way, excess sugar is really bad for us, so we have to come back to that point. But if sugar is bad for me, if it's poison, if it's toxic, if all of these hyperbolic and alarming terms pertain, and if fruit contains sugar, then I shouldn't eat fruit. Well, the reality is fruit is overwhelmingly associated with health benefit, even defense against diabetes and improvement in diabetes control, because the net effect of eating fruit is the benefit of everything that's in a fruit. And yes, there is fructose in fruit, but you don't suffer the harms of fructose any more than breathing is bad for you because there's oxygen in the atmosphere, and oxygen is toxic too at high concentrations. That doesn't mean you should hold your breath and hope for the best. Okay, there's also intrinsic sugar in all dairy products. So milk contains lactose. So for those inclined to include dairy in their diets, there is sugar there. It's part of the food. That's still very different from sugar being added to Coca-Cola and Pepsi, for example. So a fundamental area of distinction is added sugar versus intrinsic sugar. On the other hand, it is worth noting that if you eat an optimal diet, you're mostly getting your sugar from foods that contain it naturally. If you include dairy, you're getting some there. If you include fruits, you're getting it there. There's a little bit in vegetables. There's a little bit in some grains. But actually, your overall intake of sugar will tend to be low. And the father of modern toxicology, Paracelsus, famously said several centuries ago, the dose makes the poison. And that's really the key consideration with sugar. Our diets contain way too much, and too much of anything, just like too little of anything, is bad. That's what defines too much or too little. It's outside the range that's good for us. We eat way too much sugar. Everybody should be trying to cut down. But the place to focus is the added sugar, processed foods, processed beverages. By no means should people be cutting fruits out of their diet for fear that they are a delivery vehicle for fructose. They are, but in just the same way that the atmosphere we breathe is a delivery vehicle for oxygen, which is toxic at high concentrations, but essential for life. Now, just to carry out the answer a little bit further in terms of all the confusion, let's also be clear that glucose is sugar. It floats in the bloodstream. And if at any point we don't have glucose in our bloodstream, we're dead. It's that simple. So the idea that sugar is just, toxic, period, end of discussion, is extremely misleading, because it's a fuel the body runs on all the time. It is essential for life. And so, it's a little bit odd and I think confusing for people, on the one hand, to hear that you must have this in your bloodstream at all times or you cannot survive. But by the way, it's poison. That really doesn't make sense. And really what this is testimony to is our tendency in our culture to always go to extremes, to dumb things down, to be hyperbolic, to sort of look for the clickbait story as opposed to true understanding. So we have sugar in our bloodstream, we need it. Too much sugar in the bloodstream is diabetes, and that's a problem, and we'll talk about that. Excess added sugar in the food supply and in the diet, a serious problem. The intrinsic sugar in fruit, not a problem at all. One final comment, and then we can move on to many other aspects of this important discussion. Why is there so much added sugar in the food supply? Well, because people like sweet. we're born liking sweet. There are about 7 different kinds of flavors, and the only one that is an innate taste preference is sweet. And usually, Cyrus, when we have an innate preference for anything, it's about survival. It's built into our DNA. It's built into our genes. It's a reward we get for doing the thing that makes us likely to survive. Because what tends to happen is people who survive pass on the genes that help them survive. Well, it turns out that for Homo sapien babies, genes that make us like the taste of sweet tend to cause us to drink our mother's milk with a little bit more enthusiasm. That makes us grow and thrive and ultimately survive and pass along the genes that make us like sweet. Unfortunately, that survival trait has been massively exploited by big food. So all of the major food manufacturers are well aware that we like sweet. They also know that the more we get, the more we want. So one of the key things for everybody to be aware of, whether you have diabetes or don't have diabetes or at risk or not at risk, is that pretty much the entire modern food supply is spiked with sugar. It's laced with sugar, and a lot of it is stealth sugar. So everybody knows if they're eating a dessert, there's going to be sugar in it. And if you're drinking a soda, there's going to be sugar in it. But what about pasta sauce, salad dressing, pretzels, chips, crackers, bread? I mean, things we don't think of as sweet at all, and many of them we think of as salty. There is actually more added sugar per calorie in some pasta sauces than in ice cream topping. And as best I can tell, the reason for that is sugar stimulates appetite. And if food manufacturers can hide it in products, you will eat more. And if you eat more, you spend more. And if you spend more, they profit more. And unfortunately, many elements in our culture don't seem to mind profiting at the expense of public health. So that's a crucial part of the discussion too.